Hi, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final webinar in this series on EU sustainable finance, hosted by Ruud Peterson and sponsored by IOGP. So today we're going to lift our heads a little bit outside of the EU bubble to discuss the potential impact of the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance policy in other parts of the world. We have a great panel lined up for you, but we're going to start with some opening remarks from the Director of Europe for IOGP, François-Régis Mutton. François-Régis.
Many thanks, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm François-Régis Mutton, Regional Director of Europe of IOGP, and I want to welcome you all to this third and last webinar, unfortunately, of the series on sustainable finance, which we are very happy to support. Let me thank our partners at Ruud Peterson for the fantastic job they have done so far, and I hope participants found it as valuable as we did. And I also thank our dear moderator, Rachel. Thanks, Rachel, for accepting doing that. Today, we are very lucky to welcome 5 experts coming from Europe, the US, and Japan to discuss the impact of taxonomy beyond EU borders. Indeed, we may import a lot of goods, as you know, in Europe, but if there is one thing we are very good at exporting, it is legislation. Let me first insist on the fact that as oil and gas producers, we support the EU climate neutrality objective by 2050. And we are actively working to make that happen. In order to achieve this objective, we also believe that we need a policy framework that allows all sectors to contribute to this energy transition, especially in the area of sustainable finance. We have to recognize regional differences and take into account the specificities of member states. We must have everyone on board. It is also essential to consider the global perspective when developing criteria for sustainable activities and investments. International standards, benchmarks, and labels have become difficult to compare. We need better international collaboration to deliver a common language, and this is why we are here today. Companies have global activities for many of them. We need alignment between international activities to ensure harmonized and effective implementation of sustainability objectives. An international level playing field is absolutely necessary and even critical to limit carbon leakage to jurisdictions with less strict sustainable finance rules. Indeed, if we end up creating a niche market of a few super clean technologies and financial products in Europe and export all our emissions elsewhere, it won't be a success, will it? It will just be an accounting trick that results in a loss of economic activities, jobs, research development in the process. The International Platform on Sustainable Finance, IPSF, launched by the EU, could play a key role in achieving this current needed framework. And it would be highly beneficial that all relevant stakeholders, sectors, and industries, in other words, the real economy, be represented in this platform. We can all agree on the need for an ambitious and realistic sustainable financial framework. Let's just make sure nothing gets lost in translation, if I may say so. Enjoy the webinar, everyone. Rachel, and I hand it over to you as our dear co-chair of the IOGP Corporate Finance and Reporting Committee. Thank you very much.
Thanks, François-Régis. So let me set the scene for today's discussion. And of course, the EU is the first region, as François-Régis alluded to adopt a climate neutrality goal for 2050. But the EU also continues, like every other region, to have a significant funding shortfall to reach both its 2030 and its 2050 climate and energy goals. The infrastructure costs are enormous. It's billions and billions of euros each year that we need to find to meet these goals. So the energy transition that's underway is clearly it's going to cost money. And the EU is really hoping that private capital will play an important role alongside public capital, because public capital alone, of course, won't be sufficient. So while investors are looking for opportunities to get good results, good returns from sustainable opportunities and conventional investment opportunities, one of the questions today is whether the taxonomy will generate enough sustainable investment opportunities to fill this funding gap, and will it be a strong enough tool to make sure that any capital that's out there looking for a sustainable home comes to Europe rather than going elsewhere. So at present, it's very difficult to invest only in low carbon companies, low carbon sectors and assets. And there are a number of sectors that need significant access to private and public financing to tackle hard to abate emissions, particularly those carbon intensive sectors, of course. But what's happening outside of the EU? So there's a couple of points I'm just going to give as examples of what's happening in sustainable finance policy around the world. I think when you're working on EU policy, particularly as something as complex as sustainable finance, it's sometimes difficult to track what's happening elsewhere, but just a few examples for you. So Japan is likely to stop funding, public funding for coal-fired power plants overseas. We're expecting, I think, a policy announcement in the next month or so. We may get a little bit more detail from that from one of our panelists. In India, from 2022, the largest 1,000 Indian public companies will be required to disclose some very granular sustainability performance matrix. Currently, they have to make sustainability disclosures, but these are very high level. Similar, I think, to the discussion that's underway here about updating the non-financial reporting directive. The US, of course, under the Biden administration, I think it's fair to say, has got a pretty different approach from the previous administration on ESG issues. There's a host of activity underway at the SEC. And I know there's still a lot of interest in Congress about how to drive forward the climate agenda there. But interestingly, a few days ago, Standard Chartered released a survey that showed the majority of US firms remain focused on short-term profitability. 62% of the executives who were surveyed in that study said they did not think the current benefits associated with a low carbon transition would be enough to outweigh the costs. Canada is focused very much on financing the transition. They have a lot of resource-heavy sectors of the economy, and so they've got a very different approach to the one that the EU is taking. So countries are not the only groups who are looking at how to address this big funding gap that everybody has. Cities are as well. And we've one panelist who is involved in a UNEP working group looking at the role of cities and who might be able to give us some more insight later today. So as François Regis mentioned, the EU is once again leading on sustainable finance policy and certainly in the development of a taxonomy in this space. And of course, it's hoping to influence other jurisdictions to get them at least to follow the same kind of guiding principles and approach. And this, one of the ways it's going to do that, of course, is via the international platform that it's set up. But one of the questions that I have for the group today, and perhaps the audience has a similar question, is whether the current and incredibly politicized debate on the Delegated Act for climate adaptation and climate mitigation as part of that taxonomy, is it a proof point that the EU approach is overly complex and other jurisdictions are going to go their own way, perhaps with a different model entirely? Is there a race to the top or is there a race to the bottom? That's one of the points we'll be considering this afternoon. So we're hoping to spark a really good conversation with the panel today. I've got some questions ready. I'm sure they're going to be responding as well to each other's points. And for you in the audience watching, please do use the Q&A box to send us your questions. We'll be pausing. Joanna will be selecting a couple of questions after each round, just to get your viewpoints into the discussion as well. So let's get started. I'll ask the panelists, please, if they could do their best. I know it's difficult to stick to 2 to 3 minutes, at least for this opening round. For the opening round, for the audience, we're going to just give everybody a chance to give some opening remarks about their views on the taxonomy, whether it is a helpful approach if we do see this idea of a race to the top or a race to the bottom, perhaps. And I'll start with Maarten Vleeschhouwer. He joined the 2 Degree Investing Initiative last summer. It's an independent non-profit think tank working to align financial markets and regulation with the Paris Agreement, so a very important body. His focus is as the strategic lead for the PACTA platform. And if I have this right, it's a climate scenario analysis tool, Maarten. He was formerly in DG FISMA, so he is actually one of the architects of the taxonomy itself. And Maarten, this taxonomy must be a dream come true for the 2° investing initiative. But give us your thoughts on how you approach the taxonomy here.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Pleasure to be here, and it's interesting to be on the other side on taxonomy panels these days, and not on the commission side. But no, I think as 2° investing initiative, I think, well, one of the things, as you mentioned, we have developed an open source climate scenario analysis tool, which is effectively a tool that allows you to measure your alignment with the Paris Agreement. And there is a strong link there with the taxonomy, in the sense that the thresholds that the taxonomy tries to set, and also as they progress over time, is all about the Paris Agreement and helping us to achieve those goals. So the kind of alignment with the Paris Agreement is a thought that is also deeply ingrained and embedded in the taxonomy. I think maybe as kind of a starting point of departure, I think what is important, and that's perhaps something where coming from more the origins of the taxonomy, I think what's important to bear in mind also is that the taxonomy was a clear request from the financial community. So we had the high-level expert group, and it was a clear outcome that investors were asking for definitions of what is green, and asking for a green list. And so I think that's always important to bear in mind. I think what's also important to bear in mind is that the taxonomy is not a silver bullet. It is not your one tool or one metric that will fix all your problems. And in fact, they don't exist. I mean, neither this great tool that we think it's great that we've developed as 2° also won't solve all your problems. And it's the same with the taxonomy. It is one tool, I think, in the sustainable finance toolbox. And its relation and interaction with other tools is what ultimately will help it to have an impact. I think another important point to consider as part of this discussion is that the taxonomy, in a way, I think you can see it as a green list, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that is on that list is a good investment. Right. So this is also something that's very important for, investors and whoever wants to invest in green activities. They need to make a call about whether it is also a financially sound investment. So I think that's also an important consideration. And finally, I think just as a kind of starting point, I think one fear that there might be, or that we've sometimes seen, is that when governments or jurisdictions come with legislation and come sometimes with protracted or complex legislation, there can be this wait and see approach, like, oh well, I'll hold off for now and I'll wait and see what comes out of that entire process. And I think that is also something we need to be mindful of and need to avoid where possible, because it is important that financial institutions incorporate climate considerations. So I think that's also an important point to make in this regard.
Yeah, thanks, Maarten. I think we'll come back to that idea of leaders and followers when we would touch upon COP26 a little bit later. But thanks for that. Next speaker, we are thrilled to have Amane Yamazaki. He is Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Business Office at Japan's largest bank, the MUFG. He's also an advisory committee member for environmental and social considerations at the Japan International Cooperation Agency. So, Amane, I wonder if you've got any thoughts as somebody who's sitting in a different part of the world on what's happening here at the EU level.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. And also thank the organizers for inviting us at Japanese Bank to this hot topic discussion for today. And just a quick introduction of ourselves. And as mentioned by Rachel, MUFG is the largest financial institution in Japan with its integrated business covering commercial banking, trust banking, and securities. And we're very, very proud of being globally ranked #1 or 2 in the past 5 years in a row at the lead arranger league table in the green finance arena. And also we are one of the largest green bond issuers in Japan. And Quite recently, Japanese Prime Minister Mr. Suga announced the government commitment to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And we understand the banking sector in Japan would play an important role to finance the transition. So, well, to the point for taxonomy discussion for today, if we imagine the carbon neutral world, we agree sustainable economic activities defined under the EU taxonomy should have become the majority of the economy by 2050. So in this sense, we deem the taxonomy quite useful to assist disclosure efforts as a tool to gauge and track sustainable activities over time towards 2050. But maybe we believe taxonomy would be positioned as a framework to facilitate transition to a carbon neutral world and for mainstreaming climate finance with a meaningful scale. In this sense, taxonomy should be flexible enough to support not only pure green activities, technologies, but also the efforts aiming to become green or greener. And taxonomy should take more gradual approach to support transition or innovation to become greener. And this gradual approach could be used in the context of applying taxonomy in the areas of facilitating sustainable finance and the managing risk appropriately and improving transparency. And for that purpose, we believe it critical to develop a widely used taxonomy from the perspective of one is acceptability to industry players, two, cost effectiveness without undue burden, and three, transparency and predictability, four, embracing diversity in transition pathways, and five, being based on science, and six, and room for flexibility and evolution. So it is important to make clear how we utilize the taxonomy as a common goal of achieving carbon neutrality in the earliest timeline. So yeah, I stop here as an opening remark.
Thank you. Thanks, Anime. And I think the discussions that are obviously underway in Japan about what kind of taxonomy might be created there, and certainly this element of flexibility and shades of green. I think our next speaker, Susana Escaria, who's with the Ministry of Environment in Portugal, and of course, Portugal holds the presidency of the council. So these kinds of discussions about how green and how flexible the taxonomy should be, I think is probably something that you're fully occupied with at the moment. So Susana, at the ministry, she's the director of Foresight and Planning, and she's also part of the member state expert group on sustainable finance that works directly with the European Commission, of course. And finally, she's also part of a UNEP working group on sustainable finance, more at the city level. But Susana, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to talk about, perhaps not only in your role as the presidency, because I know that's difficult, but just how you're thinking about the taxonomy, given there is so much political tension at the moment with the Delegated Act.
Thank you all, and thank you for this invitation and for the opportunity to share with you all our thoughts. And it's quite challenging, I think. It's very important piece of work, legislation work, the taxonomy, and it's quite challenging for financial institutions and for companies and for all the investors inside EU and outside. And the main challenge is regarding the data and the information that requires for the companies and for the financial institutions regarding the data, financial data. So everything, the most gap that we want to fulfill is the data regarding the carbon footprint of the companies and how they can manage and how the financial institutions can evaluate and assess the risk of the investment regarding that kind of data. So I think also I fully agree with Maarten that the taxonomy is very important to highlight and to make harmonized standards for all the stakeholders involved in EU and the international level. What is mostly green or not green. But this, if you ask me if it is enough, is a first important step. Maybe it's not enough, but it's very important to have this kind of boundaries that everybody knows now what is going on. Regarding the delegate acts for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, they are a bit delayed because this is a very important delegated act, and some countries try to, they think about more about this, and they have very much doubts in some cases, and they want to revise internally in their countries some of the issues that may go to be included in the taxonomy or not. For instance, the big quarrel now and the big discussion is that if nuclear is considered a green can have a green label or not, and now they think they can include as a green investments in nuclear. In Portugal, we don't agree with that. So this is one. Another one is natural gas, and we have very lobbies and very pressures to include also natural gas as green. And maybe we have some doubts in Portugal in the Minister of Environment how we can consider it fully green, the natural gas, or if it is the best way to the transition to carbon neutrality in 2050. So I think we are going to have an agreement, but you should have this agreement this month, and I think we are going to have to postpone this agreement for during the second quarter of this year. So regarding this, I think I want to highlight, as Maarten was saying, that is a very important piece of legislation, but it comes together with the other kind of tools and legal tools, such as the climate law, such as the platform that all the experts can join and discuss permanently what are the best thresholds and benchmarks to spread to all the stakeholders. And this kind of platform can also to ally to other platforms that other institutions are also to put in place, like World Bank or UNEP. I think to the start, I think is this the quite challenging to put this in place, just for financial institutions as well as for the companies. But the interest of this topic in Portugal is higher, and it becomes bigger and bigger. So everybody is putting the eyes on this. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely, Susana, this this idea of who should be participating in a transition, or how is that transition going to be achieved, is the key sticking point at the moment, it seems, at EU level. But you raised another important point there about just the multitude of work going on in different kinds of I guess, constellations of groups all around the world. So we'll definitely come back to that. But let's move to our next speaker, Andreas Barkman, who leads the European Environment Agency's work on sustainable finance. And he also represents the EEA on the European Platform on Sustainable Finance. So how are you in the EEA looking at this, Andreas? Are you thinking that it will be a helpful tool for regulatory agencies? What's your thoughts?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Yes, I mean, from the EEA side, we obviously see that we are in a critical phase when it comes to environmental degradation. And we have multiple challenges, which you also pointed out is having unheard of investment needs to be addressed. And it's clear from our side that we are at the moment, not only Europe, but in general, we are sort of beyond the point where linear thinking and incremental changes to what we do is enough. We need to step up to substantial and systemic changes to actually be able to decarbonize, meet the net zero, but also preserve biodiversity, etc. So we're in a critical period where incremental changes are simply not good enough anymore. And this is something that I think that both, you can say maybe it's easy to underestimate the speed of the transition that needs to happen now, both only in the next 10 years, but even more so up to 2050 when we talk about climate. So there is an underestimation of the transition that is needed. And here we see that the taxonomy, an ambitious taxonomy, is clearly a tool that can signal the need for speed in a certain way, because the EU taxonomy as it's constructed is about substantial contribution, for example, to climate mitigation. So we're not talking about marginal improvements, we're talking about substantial contribution. And there I think the taxonomy and the taxonomy architecture and concept can be very helpful to signal to markets, but also other public authorities as well, what constitutes then a substantial contribution that would help us moving towards this more systemic change that we actually need to go through to meet the different environmental objectives. So in that sense, the taxonomy, and again, I would stress an ambitious taxonomy will be able to do that. I think it's clear also that the taxonomy as such, as Maarten and others are saying, of course, it's only one tool in a huge toolbox, but it is an important tool. And we see that it complements the existing toolbox, both on the climate side very well, and it complements also the other toolbox in the sustainable finance side of things, both as a transparency tool, but also as a transition tool, as a communication tool. And I just want to stress one single thing maybe in the last part, is that although we talk about climate here now today, which I think is probably the right thing to do, it's important to note that what the EU taxonomy is trying to do is to make a substantial contribution to climate mitigation while not undermining the possibilities to reach other environmental objectives. Because if we do that, we haven't gained much. And this is, I think, is one of the beauties of the architecture, but it's also, of course, one of the sources of complexity. Because simply sustainability is complex, and if you want to contribute to solving one environmental objective while not undermining another one, you automatically get into a rather complex discussion. But this is the nature of the thing, and I'm quite positive that, I mean, Europe, I've been in this discussion for 4 or 5 years. I think EU is collectively on a learning curve here, and we are in a critical phase, as you say, and Susana also said now on the climate DA, that will you can say pave the way for the rest of the taxonomy. So that was my intro. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. So our last speaker this afternoon is David Henry Doyle, who's chair of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU's Sustainable Finance Task Force. And in his spare time, he's also the head of government affairs and public policy, EMEA, for S&P Global, the credit rating agency, who of course have a huge influence on the investment atmosphere for companies. So David, I just wondered if you've got some thoughts on the taxonomy and how it might work or how complex it is. Let me just hand the floor to you for a few minutes.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And S&P Global is also a data provider, an ESG data provider in this space. So, you know, across our benchmarks, ratings, and sort of ESG products, it's really an interesting discussion to be involved in. I mean, you mentioned the American Chamber of Commerce. When we first decided to get engaged on this, back in 2017, we decided to come up with 3 principles to guide all of our advocacy efforts. And those were regulatory certainty and economic stability, evidence-based policy, and thirdly, international openness. I know we're going to come on to international openness, but let's use those maybe as some benchmarks, regulatory certainty and evidence-based policy, when we're talking about, you know, the taxonomy. I think, you know, to navigate this transition, investors and companies are going to have data. They're going to have to make data-driven decisions, evidence-based decisions. Financial markets are innovating new tools to model transition risks and to tackle these informational challenges that exist today. However, there are information gaps, there are data gaps, there are definitional gaps. That requires public-private cooperation to solve. The taxonomy can be a very useful tool to solve those gaps. I think the taxonomy is a little misunderstood, a little bit like myself. We should be really careful not to stigmatize the very good intentions of the taxonomy. It will not be what everyone wants it to be. That is clear. But it has a very straightforward and fairly noble objective, defining what is an environmentally sustainable economic activity. Now, this definition is supposed to enable financial market participants, companies to make investment decisions with confidence. That's a great goal to have. So a common definition is a very useful thing. And to Maarten's point, back in 2016, companies, investors asked the Commission to provide clarity on what green meant. So we're getting clarity now. I think misunderstandings arise when the taxonomy is seen as an obstacle to investment rather than a tool for really identifying specific kinds of investments. We should really try to avoid trying to outsource the difficult policy decisions to the financial markets through the taxonomy. If we think about the original intentions of the taxonomy, a tool to identify very specific type of investment, perhaps we can kind of take some heat out of the debate. And so the second point I wanted to make is, I don't necessarily think the taxonomy will damage the ability of companies to finance the transition plans that they have. It's not about denying companies access to capital. It's about identifying sustainability opportunities for investors to make their own choices. Like I said, not everything is going to fit in the taxonomy. Financial markets, I think Maarten made a great point. They're not obliged in any way to invest exclusively in taxonomy eligible activities. The thresholds will be important, but global capital markets are global. They're eager to assist companies in pursuing a spectrum of transitional activities. Over time, there may be a premium on EU taxonomy eligible activities, investments, especially because they're likely to be in relatively short supply for the next few years. However, I don't think that necessarily cuts off the ability of companies to finance other transitional targets and activities. So to Maarten's point, the taxonomy will be one data point in the investment matrix. Investment decisions are made on data points converging. So for some actors, the taxonomy will be a very important data point, but other data points will be more important or equally important. Credit risk, business models, return on investment. These are things that financial market participants have fiduciary duties on. So, according to our data, there are other factors too. S&P Global estimates that 40% of the world's largest companies are exposed to climate risks, wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves. That's a location-specific risk. So if you build a taxonomy-eligible asset in a place where you're going to encounter climate risks like heat waves and forest fires, is that a good investment? That's the convergence of the matrix I think we have to take account. Luckily, and on a positive note, we estimate that only 29% of European large companies are exposed to that kind of risk. In the US, it's 60%. So this is, these are the facts, this is the data. I'd love to come on to the international cooperation point because I think it's essential. But can the taxonomy be a useful tool? Yes. Will it be everything to everybody? No.
Okay, thanks, David. And I think, Joanna, I know I see questions pouring in, but I am going to just take this opportunity because I do want to get to the international point and just give panelists a chance to talk about what they see there, particularly the risk of fragmentation as different regions take different approaches. Maarten, maybe I'll start with you because I know you feel quite strongly about this. What is happening and what is the risk in terms of fragmentation?
Yes, thanks. I think one thing that's happening that's quite interesting and quite positive is something that has been called a kind of race to the top. And I think that's a rather positive development. So obviously, I think it's fair to say that the EU has been a front-running jurisdiction when it comes to sustainable finance. There are other front-running jurisdictions. I mean, China has played a part in this, for example, with the Green Finance Study Group. The UK, of course. And what I think you see, and that is partially focused on taxonomies, but it's actually broader than that. It's also in relation to some of the disclosure requirements that you mentioned in your opening remarks. I think you clearly see in the international community a kind of race to the top with jurisdictions wanting to get their policies out there, wanting to show that they take this seriously, and wanting to enable the financial sector to play a part in reaching the Paris Agreement goals and the wider SDGs. I think that last point, by the way, is important. I mean, the financial sector can only play a part. I think I very much agree with David Henry. You know, we shouldn't use financial markets to outsource hard policy decisions such as pricing, carbon emissions, etc. But I think this race to the top is very positive. So you see different jurisdictions wanting to come out with their taxonomies, with different disclosure requirements, and that competitive sense, I think, is actually quite a positive development. Of course, the other side of that coin is that there is a risk of fragmentation. And so what if there's a US taxonomy, and there's a Chinese taxonomy, and there's a Canadian taxonomy, and there's an EU taxonomy, and I'm a global company, and I have, or I'm a global investor, and I have investments in Europe, and I have investments in the US. So for my investments in, I have to report in Europe on my investments. So there I follow the EU taxonomy. Maybe some of my investments in the US actually qualify under the, so you'd have to kind of, what you report as green for your EU disclosures might be different as what you report for your US disclosures, because right now, I think this is also one of the questions in the audience, the taxonomies don't really take into account where the activity is done. There's just the thresholds. So that is undoubtedly going to be, I think, confusing, especially for global actors. And that is, I think, the other side of the coin. And that's why I think there is really a strong need for governments to coordinate on this issue and to engage with each other on this issue, whether that's through, for example, the IPSF, as you mentioned, or other fora, such as the recently launched Sustainable Finance Study Group. That is going to be a very, very, very important discussion going forward.
Yeah, Maarten, thanks. And I think you touched upon this year is also a big year. We've got G20, we've got G7, both of those have got sustainable finance on their agenda. And then, of course, at the end of the year, we've got COP26 as well, which is going to bring another opportunity potentially for countries to see, okay, here are my goals and my plans, and now what's the role of finance in that? But David, I wanted you to have a chance to come in on this idea of how to navigate this very complex international patchwork that we may be approaching.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It is really complex. It's too complex for me sometimes. I think that's why we need to streamline and simplify some of the conversations that we're having and elevate them to global solutions, because there's a real risk of fragmentation and actually race to the bottom if we don't get this right. The EU deserves great credit for kickstarting the debate on sustainable finance a couple of years ago. I think now we have an opportunity in the coming months, and I really do mean months, to build some global solutions. That third principle of the Sustainable Finance Task Force that I chair in the American Chamber of Commerce is international openness, for a really important reason. Open markets are going to enable capital to find and support the best possible solutions for achieving their climate targets that we've set ourselves. International standards, compatibility between jurisdictions will drive a competitive dynamic where innovation and ambition and that drive to the top are rewarded by investors. And I think international cooperation will create a more efficient capital flow in this emerging market of ESG and sustainable assets. So the more collaborative we are, the more agile capital will be. Capital is global, capital markets are global. We should not be shutting down jurisdictions to outside investment. That's sort of a really important point. I think the work of the IFRS Foundation, IOSCO, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group that's been relaunched, they should be talking together, they are talking together, but they can generate a lot of momentum, a lot of political capital to clarify, to build compatibility. It's essential that we have at least compatibility on the things we can agree on. We will not agree in every jurisdiction about how to measure sustainability, I think. Different versions of materiality will continue to exist. International cooperation, to conclude, will also ensure that the EU taxonomy remains responsive to change. And other jurisdictions might develop better methods of measuring or better, more efficient systems. The EU should be open to learning from other jurisdictions and adapting to the best possible solutions. International dialogue will help that.
Great, thanks, David. And I think you touch upon a really important element there, which is the financial system, to some extent, over the last 3-4 years has done an enormous amount by itself in the absence of a kind of a strong policy framework for sustainable finance. But I think what we're seeing now, and to your point, why it's so important that governments really coordinate, even if they don't agree on the metrics or the materiality aspects of it, but they agree on fundamental principles and how the different systems might talk to each other. Because I do think we're at the limit of what is possible from the financial institution, from the investment community, without that regulatory framework. Before we go, Joanna, I know you want to get to the audience questions. Mr. Yamazaki, do you have any other points in terms of how this might develop with Asia? I know Japan is obviously very involved in a lot of G7, G20 discussions and always wants to play a leading role. But any thoughts from you in terms of that cooperation between different parts of the world?
Sure. Yeah. Before talking about it, I think it is the discussion. I would like to discuss it in this way, that pursuing green alone is not enough to achieve the Paris goals or carbon neutrality by 2050. This is my opinion. And for example, if we replace all the coal-fired power plants in the EU, existing and operating in the EU, with gas-fired power, then GHG emission will be cut by half immediately, and they estimated to reduce approximately 200 million tons of GHG emission annually, which contributes to Paris Agreement goals achieved by 2030, and also carbon neutrality by 2050 if we switch the fuel source to hydrogen by then. So that's one example, but these ideas came from continuous discussion within the industry player through, say, Japanese Keidanren, Japan Business Federation. So the echo to Maarten's point, I think it is from the international dimension from Asian region. We believe that efforts to harmonize the taxonomy across the region will become more important and relevant. And for example, in Japan, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry set up a study group on environmental innovation and finance and prepared a climate innovation finance strategy 2020, promoting transition, green innovation, and financing them, so-called TGIF strategy. And also jointly with JFSA and the Ministry of Environment, set up a task force on preparation of environment for transition finance and formulate Japan's basic principles for transition finance. And other example is that Singapore Authority released a consultation paper for green finance industry task force in January this year, and setting out taxonomy for Singapore-based financial institutions. This allows yellow color in a traffic light system, not a binary approach of whether green or red. So it is, and also it is intended to be used not only Singapore, but also in the ASEAN region as well. So needless to say, climate change is a global challenge and cannot be solved by a single country or region alone. So we note that the international fora, such as FSB, Basel Committee, and HFS, have started discussion of putting together standards, principles of risk management framework, and disclosures. So taxonomy will be used in this exercise, and for this reason, we believe the efforts to harmonize the taxonomy widely acceptable across the region will become more important and relevant. So that's my comment.
Great, thank you. Great points, Joanna. Let's jump in and see how many of these audience questions we can respond to before we need to wrap up. Why don't you choose the first one for us and we'll see who would like to answer.
Yes, so we have touched on some of the questions already, but how about this one? In assessing the investments in terms of taxonomy, should the whole value chain be considered?
Who would like to talk about that? Has anyone got any thoughts about value chains?
And should there be an internationally agreed way of doing this?
Yes. Andreas, I'm not sure if you're trying to respond, you're on mute still.
I think it depends a little bit on your architecture of the taxonomy, clearly. I mean, the EU taxonomy is based on, where possible, life cycle considerations when it sets the performance criteria. And in that sense, you could say it includes a certain part of a value chain when we talk about performance criteria. It also allows, for example, enabling activities. So an activity that is enabling another activity to substantially contribute to an environmental objective, which is also kind of a little bit of like a semi-value chain. I think that going down the whole value chain route is complexifying things probably too much to make it operational. We can see that in some cases when we talk about life cycle issues in general, but I think to have a blanket approach to go for value chain is practically very, very difficult.
Susana or Maarten, any additional thoughts? Or David, I see you've come off mute.
I was just going to add that, financial markets, investors, companies are increasingly paying a lot of attention to their value chains. There was a value chain disruption in the Suez Canal last week that cost a lot of money to a lot of people. That's a very simple example, but ESG risks in the value chain are something that companies are increasingly focused on, investors are increasingly focused on, people want disclosure around that. I think you do have to keep proportionality in mind, to Andreas's point, but markets are already doing it. To what extent the taxonomy should try and solve for the entire value chain, that might be a bit complicated, but markets are asking themselves these questions and innovating ways to find the answers to certain questions.
Susana?
Market and the stakeholders are urging for data and for information and for standards. And I fully agree when you say that we have to have a strong and a broad political commitment, because everybody was saying that knowledge, sharing the knowledge and the experience is key to move on. But in fact, I think I fully agree with David and with Andreas, and we need to pay attention to all the value chains, to all the sectors of the value chains, for sure. So if you have a strong global cooperation, more and more sharing experience is very useful to build this kind of trust in the system and this kind of trust in the taxonomy. So I think we have to act in all the value chain.
Thanks. Joanna, why don't we try to take one more?
There's a question that, do you think that the real economy, including the companies representing the energy transition, will be represented in the International Platform for Sustainable Finance? And perhaps another one related is a question that, of course, the scale of investment needed to reach net zero is huge. And we need to support also companies who are not yet green, but have a credible plan to becoming green. So how can taxonomy and other policy tools be used to achieve that?
Yeah, so I think on the first question, that's a little challenging given we don't have anyone from the Commission on. But I should imagine that companies would like to be involved in as many discussions via platforms as possible. So maybe we'll focus on the second question, just how do we bring along those companies who've got a credible plan, and then maybe some discussion about how do you determine if a plan is credible or not. But how do we bring those companies along? Maarten, I don't know if you've thoughts or yeah, go ahead.
Sure. No, I think that's I think it's a good question. I think maybe on one, I would say maybe two parts to the answer. One, I think it's, again, need to bear in mind that taxonomy is one tool in helping us scale up the investments that we need. The taxonomy by itself is not going to help us shift the trillions. It needs to be complemented by other sustainable finance initiatives, but more importantly, by other non-finance sector policies. I mean, you need carbon pricing. Right. I mean, if we had a global carbon price, you could actually do away with a lot of side legislation, because that would already, this pricing of externalities would already help. But in the case of a company that's transitioning, I think the taxonomy can definitely help. I mean, that is part of the plan that you can show to investors, saying, like, right now I'm producing internal combustion engine cars, but I'm going to, I want to create or produce more electric cars, or I want to, meet that threshold of the taxonomy. And if you invest in me, or if you help me, change my production lines, then I can go and meet those targets. You see now a rise of sustainability-linked loans and sustainability-linked bonds, where companies commit themselves to reaching certain sustainability targets. Those targets could be based on the taxonomy, for example. So I think the taxonomy can definitely help companies explain where they're intending to go.
Right.
Yeah, sometimes the stakeholders and the companies feel the difficulty to explain how they can move on and to use the taxonomy in the specific project, because the taxonomy is designed for sectors. So yeah, sometimes it's difficult to translate to that kind of projects for if they want to move on and to become green. So again, I think data is the missing link here. So all the stakeholders ask for capacitation and to learn more about this. So
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Andreas?
Can I just compliment there? I mean, the current EU taxonomy framework is indeed, as Maarten was also indicating, allowing transition finance. I mean, that is a built-in feature. It may be maybe not obvious, but the taxonomy is then providing a classification system, obviously, as we know. But what matters is, of course, your investments towards reaching that performance level. And if you're going, so you can, the taxonomy already recognizes that CapEx, for example, investments from a point which may not be green towards that green point that the taxonomy is defining, then that CapEx, if it's part of a transition plan, is counted as green. So that it's very important to make the distinction between the definition of green economic activities and the green investments, or what will be counted as green investments from a starting point. So the flexibility is quite large, actually, in terms of counting certain types of investments as green, as long as they're part of a plan and they reach the substantial contribution of the taxonomy. This will be further clarified in a delegated act by the Commission in June on how these, you could say, reporting and accounting rules for what is, you could say, the green money part of this. So it's already kind of built in, but it is often missed in the discussion.
Yeah, David, I don't know if you've any thoughts about that kind of I guess, fuzziness or misinterpretation, and just to pick up on Susana's point about the data, the actual information that is going to come from asset owners and issuers as the most critical piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to where we started, which is the taxonomy has a specific goal. It can only do so much. It does have certain disclosure obligations for companies within the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. The non-financial reporting directive needs to be fixed, though, and it will be fixed next month. What are the critical data points that we need to have the NFRD solve for capital markets, for financial markets? What we've done to date is create a series of obligations, really very detailed obligations on financial market participants to scrutinize their investments, to disclose principal adverse impacts on sustainability. But what they're lacking, and what everyone is lacking, is the data. So how do we solve for that in an efficient, proportionate way? How do we link it to the discussions that are going on at the international level around harmonizing sustainability reporting standards, setting a benchmark that is meaningful, but is not overly burdensome, and that actually, for companies who are smaller, that they have the ability to show that they may be greener and more innovative, or doing something that's particularly interesting that isn't necessarily taxonomy aligned, but is in line with what a private equity investor wants to do and scale, and build that into the next unicorn. Disclosure is the missing piece of the puzzle. Solving it at international level would be fantastic.
Agree.
Europe will continue to lead on this, I think. But let's talk to each other about a global solution. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, I think for any of us involved in reporting, just navigating different requirements and different ESG reporting frameworks, it's getting to the point where it's really untenable now, and not necessarily always useful information that's requested through these existing frameworks. So I know we're rapidly running out of time. If anyone has any points that they haven't made, I know we didn't touch really upon COP26 and the kind of boost that might give to the sustainable finance discussion globally, that kind of coordinating piece. But I do think that is something to watch, and I suspect the EU and the US will play a pretty big role there over the next few months. No other comments from panelists?
Rachel, I would just say, you mentioned the word months. The political opportunity is in months, to be honest, for some of these activities. The deadlines are ambitious. People complain about the deadlines all the time, but the challenge is serious as well. So they need ambitious timelines to be resolved. I think we should be optimistic. The more optimism we have, the less room there is for disagreement, because people assume the best. And I think when we come to the question of fragmentation, if everyone approaches it with an optimism and a political can-do attitude, we may be surprised what we can actually achieve.
So, yeah, go on, Andreas.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo that. I'm also quite optimistic. I mean, there are obviously challenges ahead on data reporting side and fragmentation, etc. But what I think what we'll see in the next few months, or next 6 months, is a stronger convergence on what the end, for example, on the climate side, the end goal is in terms of net zero emissions, and that if that is becoming even more clear and embedded in a wide range of jurisdictions across the globe, then it will be, it will definitely provide policy certainty of the end goal. And then the rest of the discussion on what is then making a substantial contribution to meeting these net zero emission goals, what needs to be invested in, what may not be need to be invested in, what type of R&D do we need, etc. So I think I'm quite optimistic that there will be a broader consensus around the scale and the transition speed that is needed, the end goal, and then from that through the different initiatives around the globe, I think there are 20 countries now working on different type of taxonomies. That will give a good foundation for these taxonomies to mutually understand each other better and cross-fertilize. So I'm optimistic.
Susana, last word from you.
Yeah, I'm also optimistic. I think everybody in every country in the world feel the same need, the need for sharing and the need for a global commitment. So I think they are going to push forward for the politicians to have a global commitment, and the COP26 may be the trigger to do that, and because they are going to be obliged to, because every stakeholders are urged for that. So also I think we are going to reach some consensus, and we have going to move forward to this, because everybody feels that is need, not only for the climate issues and social economic issues, but also as an image and a reputation signal for everybody. So I think we have to do this in the end of the year, is the starting point of this. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's wrap up. We're at time already. It's unbelievable. Time's flown by. But I think from the discussion today, it's really clear we're at an important juncture, not only for the EU taxonomy itself, but just as panelists have said, this kind of momentum towards reaching consensus, whether that's at COP or in other bodies going on, because there is a huge amount of work underway in different jurisdictions on sustainable finance. And I don't think it's feasible for a patchwork approach to emerge and continue. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. A huge thank you to the panelists for being here, for your thoughts. Excellent insights from all of you. Thank you to Maarten, who was the moderator for the previous two webinars, to Ruud Peterson, particularly to Joanna and Natalia, who've been working very hard behind the scenes, François Regis, Mathilde and Narek at IOGP as well. And happy Easter, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.